The DA says it's taken note of revelations that President Cyril Ramaphosa, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana and Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago met to respond to what the party calls the growing government-induced public financial crisis. A Sunday Times report suggests that the secret meeting was held in Stellenbosch this past week. DA Finance spokesperson Dr. Dion George joins us for more on this. Dr. George, a very good evening. Now, what is the current situation regarding South Africa's finances? And why is there concern about a cash crunch, if indeed there is?
Well, there certainly is a cash crunch. Government projected a growth of about 1.4% over the next 3 years when the budget was presented in February of this year. Now, we haven't got growth anywhere near that. We had 0.6% in the last quarter. And that means that government has over-projected revenue. And that over-projection is approximately 65 billion rand. So the problem the government has is that it actually doesn't have enough money to fund the programs that it has in the budget. So something has to give. Now we're having the medium-term budget policy statement in October, which is the mid-year adjustment. And I think that that's what government is now having the discussion about. But another problem is that the social relief of distress grant was not budgeted for in the new financial year that starts from the 1st of April 2024. So government has a big problem because what it needs to do is fund that 65 billion rand gap. Plus, it also has to find the money to extend the social relief of distress grant, which it hasn't got in the budget. So we're looking at about a hole of about 100 billion rand, and that's a lot of money. And that's the problem. So government has essentially run out of money to pay for its programs. And that's why they're talking about cutting back. But the big question is then, where does government cut? And of course, the big thing is, well, if we had growth, there wouldn't be this problem. But our economy is not growing. So government needs to take action to get the economy to grow and to make sure it cuts its expenditure enough so that it can actually fit the fiscal space. Alternately, government will have to borrow more money. And the problem is that our interest payments are starting to crowd out service delivery. So it's a really rough spot that the Minister of Finance finds himself in.
Now, Dr. George, clearly government finds itself in a pickle. What are the implications of this cash crunch on the average person on the street? What does it mean? What does it mean for me?
Well, very significantly, it means that government won't be able to pay for all its programs. And if they're talking about cutting back, for example, on visible policing, cutting back on basic infrastructure, for example, paying for infrastructure development, etc., we'll find that our roads start deteriorating. We'll start to see that the provinces will get less money. And so we'll then have a problem in our education and in our healthcare budgets in the provinces. And of course, the big one was that if there's no extension of the social relief of distress grant, what does it mean to those households? Although it's a very small amount of money, they are actually relying on that. Unfortunately, in South Africa, which is actually a rich country, we're not a poor country. We're only having this problem because government made the wrong choices. Now, we've got starvation in South Africa. It is a real problem. And that should not be happening in a country that's as rich as ours. And so that impacts on the most vulnerable South Africans. For South Africans who are fortunate enough to have a job and in a better circumstance, crowding out service delivery impacts on everybody because what happens is then you have problems with less police, for example, so your crime increases. You have less access to, for example, if you look at the government, what's government supposed to deliver, the services, for example, at Home Affairs, it's already bad enough. So what does it mean? When they start saying we're going to cut back on frontline personnel, then, well, who's going to deliver that service? So that's what happens. The ecosystem starts to erode because government's wasting a huge amount of money on things that it doesn't need to pay for. But it chooses to place itself in the wrong place in the economy. That's the big problem. And as that starts to get crowded out, your ordinary South Africans who are already overtaxed might very well face an increase in tax. There's this discussion apparently about increasing VAT by around 2%. Now that's completely untenable. We also see the fact that the fuel price remains high because government cannot take out the fuel levy, the administered fuel levy that's driving the price of petrol and driving inflation. Why? It's because government's not making prudent decisions fiscally or to grow the economy.
Now, Dr. George, I'd like to think there are a couple of options on how government can choose to deal with this, right? So, and potential pitfalls either way. So there's the economic challenge to, for instance, the social relief of distress grant in addressing the solution. And then there's also the politics around it. Now, ANC still wants to govern in 2024, and that's just around the corner. Now, if they pull the plug on the social relief of distress grant, then they're in serious trouble because they lose multiple voters. What options are available to government to deal with this?
Well, I actually did ask the Minister of Finance several months ago, just after the budget was issued. I actually asked, where is the line item for the social relief of distress grant? Because there's no way, certainly I thought, there's no way that government is not going to budget for that, especially in the lead up to election, but also due to the fact that people are actually starving and need the money. And the response I got was that there was going to be this new social support model, this new social support structure that was going to be developed, and that would be rolled out. Now, of course, it never happened. Why? Because government is actually unable to plan effectively, clearly, and also because there is no money for it. So it certainly is not in the interest of the ANC to have a grant disappearing right before an election. You know, but I mean, the core thing is that, never mind the election, the fact that how do people actually live then if they're not getting this small amount of money? But if we focus on that, then the question is, and that's probably what the mad scramble is all about, is where will this money come from? Now, there's not space to borrow more. Now, there's also this possibility that government would issue US dollar denominated bonds and then borrow more money, but that makes the deficit wider. And it also then in the longer term will come back and bite. So if you're going to look at the short term, government has to decide where it's going to cut. And that was what that meeting apparently was about. And so government was looking at the periphery of this problem. So, for example, encouraging older public servants to retire earlier, to cut back on visible policing, to rationalize the number of departments, ministries, make the cabinet smaller. Now, those are things that can be done in a reasonably short period of time, but they are painful nonetheless. So government will have to choose that. We agree, the DA agrees that the cabinet is too big and that needs to be rationalized, but we do not agree that if you go and encourage people to retire from the public service, that's a solution. Because yes, some money would be saved, but what needs to happen is that the whole public service needs to be looked at and slimmed down, especially all of the managers that are deployed to the public sector on large salaries, the millionaire managers who are adding no value. That's where we need to cut. Also,
Dr.
for example...
George, allow me to ask one more question. I'll literally have 60 seconds before the top of the hour, and we have to go. Now, if the DA were to govern, how would you deal with the social relief of distress grant?
We would keep the grant in place in the short run, but we would focus on making sure the economy can grow. Because as the economy grows, you actually have more people getting into employment. But we would continue that grant, and we would also look to migrating towards a basic income grant over time, depending, of course, on economic growth. That's what we would do in the very short run. Obviously, we would have to spend a lot more time turning the economy around, but it starts with positive sentiment. So if there is a new government, for example, that can actually inspire confidence for investing locally and internationally, then we would be heading in the right direction. At the moment, there is no confidence. And also because government has chosen very bad foreign policy, veered off its non-aligned stance. That's driving out foreign investment as well. And that's not very good for anybody in South Africa. That's one of the crucial problems.
Dr. Dion George, appreciate your time. And he's the DA spokesperson on finance, attending to SA's funding crisis as the DA.